Good evening and welcome to Inspector Purbright Mysteries on BBC Radio. Our story begins with a most peculiar discovery, a grave in the municipal cemetery that is completely empty. Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell's final resting place contains no Mrs. Hartwell at all, whether you're listening from London, Manchester, or anywhere around the world. Tonight, we visit the quiet market town of Flaxborough. First, tell us, where are you tuning in from tonight? The Flaxborough Municipal Cemetery Committee had gathered in the Corn Exchange on a Tuesday morning that threatened rain without quite committing to it, the sort of weather that encouraged civic duty by making outdoor alternatives seem inadvisable. Mrs. Ida Bracknell, who had served as committee chairman for 7 consecutive years and intended to serve for 7 more, rapped her gavel with the authority of someone who had never doubted that order was preferable to chaos, particularly when she was the one maintaining it. Item 4, she announced, consulting her typed agenda with the reverence others reserved for scripture. Cemetery path improvements and safety considerations. Mr. Pegg, Walter Pegg, the cemetery keeper, rose with the deliberate movements of a man who had spent 30 years persuading the earth to accept what people insisted on putting into it. His cap, removed in deference to Mrs. Bracknell's views on indoor etiquette, rested on the chair beside him like a patient dog. "It's about the main path through Section C," Pegg began, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who dealt in facts rather than opinions. "The Ladies' Guild has complained again about the state of the walkway near the older graves. Says it's a hazard to visitors paying their respects. Councillor Oswald Kemp, whose considerable bulk suggested a man who had never met a civic luncheon he couldn't attend, leaned forward with interest. Hazard in what sense precisely? Tree roots have lifted some of the stones. Paths become uneven. Mrs. Whitmore from the Guild nearly took a tumble last week, though she was wearing those shoes with the heels that would challenge a mountaineer." Pegg paused, allowing this observation to settle. "The committee asked me to level things out, make it safe for the bereaved and the merely curious." "Quite right," murmured Mr. Sidney Merriman, the town clerk, who approached all municipal matters with the caution of someone who had once misfiled an important document and lived in terror of repetition. "Public safety must be our paramount concern." Mrs. Bracknell nodded approvingly. "And you've made progress with this work, Mr. Pegg?" "I have," Pegg replied. "Started yesterday morning with the worst section near the Hartwell family plot. That's where Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell rests. Died in 48, if memory serves. Her stone had tilted something fierce, and the path curved round it like a stream round a boulder." He paused, and in that pause, the committee sensed the approach of something more interesting than routine maintenance. "Only when I lifted the stone to reset it properly, I found something peculiar." Pegg's expression remained unchanged, but his voice carried a note that made Mrs. Bracknell set down her teacup. "Peculiar in that there wasn't anything there to find." "I beg your pardon?" This from Canon Halden, who served as the committee's spiritual advisor, and whose experience with resurrection was, he preferred to think, purely theological. "No grave," Pegg explained with the patience of someone accustomed to urban minds struggling with rural realities. "Just earth. Solid, undisturbed earth, like nobody had ever put a spade to it. The stone was set proper, the curbing all in place, but underneath." He shrugged. "Nothing but clay that's been minding its own business since the conquest." Mr. Merriman consulted his ledger with the desperate hope that bureaucracy might explain what nature apparently could not. "Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell, interred March 15, 1948. All fees paid, all procedures followed. The Reverend Tompkins officiated. He's been gone these 20 years, of course." "Which makes it tidy," observed Pegg dryly. "Can't ask him what he remembers burying." Mrs. Bracknell's expression suggested she found the situation personally affronting. "Mr. Pegg, you must be mistaken. People don't simply misplace the deceased." "I know an empty hole when I dig one," Pegg replied with unshakable calm. and I know what Earth looks like when it's been disturbed and when it hasn't. Mrs. Hartwell's plot shows no sign of ever having been opened. Stone was set on top of ground that's never seen a coffin. Canon Holden cleared his throat delicately. Could there have been administrative confusion? Perhaps Mrs. Hartwell was interred elsewhere? Checked the adjacent plots, Peg said. All accounted for. Besides, the Hartwells have been in that section for generations. Family plot, all proper and recorded. A small silence fell over the committee, broken only by the sound of Mrs. Bracknell's pencil tapping against her agenda. It was the sort of silence that preceded either profound revelation or profound embarrassment, and in Flaxborough, the latter was generally considered the more likely outcome. "This is most irregular," Mrs. Bracknell finally announced, as if irregularity were a personal failing of the deceased. "Mr. Merriman, what is our position regarding graves that appear to be unoccupied?" The town clerk's face took on the expression of a man who had just been asked to explain the municipal policy on dragons. "Our position," he said carefully, "is that we have never before encountered such a situation. However, I believe, that is, I suspect, we may need to involve the constabulary, the police." Canon Holden looked as if someone had suggested involving the fire brigade in the Sunday service. Surely that's rather extreme. "Not extreme," said Mrs. Bracknell, who had spent 7 years learning that civic problems, like weeds, were best addressed before they could spread. "Thorough. Mr. Merriman, please telephone Inspector Purbright. Explain the situation with appropriate discretion." "Discretion," repeated Merriman, as if testing the word's weight. "Yes, quite." 20 minutes later, Inspector Purbright received Mr. Merriman's call while contemplating a report about stolen garden gnomes, a crime wave that had puzzled Flaxborough for 3 weeks and showed no signs of abating. He listened to the town clerk's careful explanation with the patience of someone who had learned that unusual problems generally had mundane solutions, though they occasionally took their time revealing them. "An empty grave," Purbright repeated thoughtfully. "How refreshingly straightforward." "Straightforward." Merriman's voice carried a note of hope. "Oh yes. Either Mrs. Hartwell is somewhere she shouldn't be, or she isn't somewhere she should be. Both possibilities are quite manageable." Purbright paused. "I'll have a look this afternoon. Please ask Mr. Peg to leave everything exactly as he found it." "Of course, Inspector." "And discretion?" "Mr. Merriman," Purbright said gently, "I have never yet solved a case by announcing it in the market square. Discretion is my natural condition." That afternoon, Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love made their way through the cemetery's wrought iron gates, past the newer sections with their tidy rows of uniform headstones, toward the older area, where Victorian angels kept eternal watch over their charges, with varying degrees of success. The threatened rain had materialized into a fine mist that made everything appear slightly apologetic, as if the weather itself were uncertain about its intentions. Peg waited by the Hartwell plot, having replaced the stone and curbing exactly as they had been, though the slight disturbance of the surrounding grass betrayed recent activity. He nodded to the 2 policemen with the friendliness of someone who had nothing to hide and little patience for those who did. "Shall I lift it again?" Peg asked without preamble. "If you would be so kind," Purbright replied. The process took several minutes, with Sergeant Love lending his considerable strength to the task. When the stone was finally moved aside and the curbing lifted, the truth of Peg's observation became unmistakable. The earth beneath was dense, undisturbed clay, showing none of the telltale signs of burial. No settled depression, no mixed soil, no fragments of wood or metal that might indicate a coffin's presence. Purbright crouched beside the opening, running his fingers along the cut edges where Peg's spade had entered. The soil was clean, uniform, bearing no trace of the disturbance that should have marked a grave nearly 40 years old. "Interesting," he murmured. straightening. "Mr. Pegg, in your experience, how long would you expect to see evidence of a burial in soil like this?" "Decades," Pegg replied, without hesitation. "Clay holds its shape. You can spot where a grave's been dug 50, 60 years later if you know what to look for. This," he gestured at the undisturbed earth, "this has never been touched." Sergeant Love, who approached mysteries with the methodical enthusiasm of someone solving crossword puzzles, ventured, "Could the records be wrong? Wrong plot, perhaps." "Possible," Purbright agreed. "Though Mr. Merriman's records are generally reliable, and the Hartwells have been using this section for some time." He looked thoughtfully at the adjacent graves, reading the inscriptions with the attention of someone who believed that stones, like people, sometimes said more than they intended. "We'll need to see those records," he continued, "all of them, and we'll need to speak with anyone who might remember Mrs. Hartwell's funeral." He paused, considering. It was 1948, so there may still be people about who attended. Pegg carefully replaced the curbing and stone, working with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the dead, whatever their current location, deserved proper treatment. The grave resumed its appearance of settled permanence, giving no hint of the mystery it had revealed. As they walked back toward the cemetery gates, Purbright found himself considering the peculiar nature of the problem. In his experience, crimes generally involve the presence of things that shouldn't be there, or the absence of things that should be. This case presented the latter situation in its purest form. A grave that wasn't marking the resting place of someone who apparently wasn't resting there. "Not exactly your typical Tuesday afternoon," observed Sergeant Love, who had a gift for understatement that Purbright found professionally useful. "No," Purbright agreed, pausing to watch a robin investigate the base of a weathered headstone with the focused attention of a fellow investigator. "Though I've found that typical Tuesday afternoons are rather overrated. They tend to be less instructive than the unusual ones." He turned back toward the town center, where the ordinary business of Flaxborough continued its gentle course, unaware that somewhere in its orderly municipal records lay the answer to a question that shouldn't have needed asking: where, exactly, was Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell? By the following morning, the weather had settled into one of those pale, dutiful brightnesses that made Flaxborough appear almost virtuous, though Inspector Purbright had long since learned that appearances in the town were as reliable as campaign promises. The matter of Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell's absent remains had already begun its inevitable journey through the community's informal communication network, traveling by routes no postman could chart and gathering embellishments like a snowball rolling downhill. The process had begun, as these things always did, with the best of intentions. Mr. Pegg had mentioned to his wife that his overalls required soaking after yesterday's unusual digging. Mrs. Pegg, who possessed the social instincts of a seasoned diplomat, had shared this domestic detail with Mrs. Alty at the haberdashery shop, framing it as a matter of laundry rather than mystery. Mrs. Alty, however, had detected the scent of something more interesting than soap powder, and had passed the tale along to the assistant at the railway bookstall, who in turn had delivered it to the station buffet along with the morning newspapers. By 10 o'clock, the buffet was offering, alongside tea of respectable strength, the information that Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell had never been properly buried at all. By 10:30, this had evolved into speculation about wartime shortages affecting funeral arrangements, which seemed plausible enough to survive its first encounter with skeptical listeners. Mrs. Ida Bracknell, who had spent 7 years learning that civic problems required immediate attention before they could metastasize into civic scandals, received 2 telephone calls before her morning coffee had properly cooled. The first came from Councillor Kemp, who described the situation as delicate, a word he employed when he meant it might eventually embarrass him. The second arrived from Canon Halden, who inquired whether she preferred the term administrative irregularity to clerical error in any public statements that might become necessary. Mrs. Bracknell recommended no public statements whatsoever and suggested that any inquiries be directed to Mr. Merriman, whose institutional patience was, she believed, more robust than her personal reserves. At the police station, Inspector Purbright found Sergeant Love already installed with a cup of tea and an expression that suggested he had spent his morning wrestling with uncomfortable thoughts. The sergeant looked up as Purbright entered, relief evident in his features. "Morning, sir. I've been thinking about yesterday's discovery, and I'm afraid the more I consider it, the less sense it makes." "An encouraging sign, Sergeant," Purbright replied, hanging his coat with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for a long day. "Mysteries that make immediate sense are generally not mysteries at all, merely situations awaiting the proper paperwork." He settled at his desk and opened the file that Mr. Merriman had delivered an hour earlier, a collection of documents that represented the municipal memory of Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell's final arrangements. The records were exemplary in their completeness. Burial fees paid in full, plot assignment properly recorded, death certificate filed with appropriate signatures. Everything suggested a funeral that had proceeded with bureaucratic precision. "The documentation appears unassailable," Purbright observed, scanning the neat handwriting that recorded Mrs. Hartwell's transition from living resident to municipal responsibility, which raises the question of why reality has chosen to disagree with it so emphatically. Their first interview of the day was with Dr. Geoffrey Carfax, who had signed Mrs. Hartwell's death certificate and whose memory, despite advancing years, remained admirably precise regarding his professional duties. They found him in his garden, engaged in the sort of autumn tidying that suggested a man who believed in maintaining order even when nature clearly preferred chaos. "Inspector Purbright." Dr. Carfax straightened, brushing soil from his hands. "This is unexpected. Nothing serious, I hope?" "Nothing immediate, Doctor. We're hoping you might assist with some questions about a former patient, Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell, who died in 1948. Dorothy Hartwell." Dr. Carfax removed his gardening gloves with the careful attention of someone accustomed to precise movements. "Yes, I remember her quite clearly. Pneumonia, following a prolonged bout of bronchitis. Not uncommon for someone of her age and constitution." He gestured toward his house. "Please, come inside." I was just about to have my morning tea. The doctor's sitting room bore the comfortable accumulation of a long professional life. Medical journals dating back decades, a human skull serving as an optimistic bookend, and photographs of patients' children who had grown up to become patients themselves. Dr. Carfax settled into his chair with the satisfaction of someone who had earned his comfort through decades of service. "What brings Mrs. Hartwell to police attention after all these years?" he asked, pouring tea with hands that remained steady despite their age. "There's been some question about her burial arrangements," Purbright replied carefully. "Nothing dramatic, merely administrative confusion that we're hoping to resolve." "Administrative confusion?" Dr. Carfax nodded thoughtfully. There was rather a lot of that in those days. The war had disrupted so many procedures, and we were all still finding our feet in peacetime. He paused, his expression growing distant. Dorothy was a quiet woman, kept very much to herself after her husband Frederick died. No immediate family, which made her final illness rather complicated. In what way complicated? She had no one to care for her properly. I visited regularly, of course, but she needed more attention than professional calls could provide. Fortunately, Mrs. Amelia Crispin from the tea shop took an interest. Wonderful woman, though she can be rather managing when circumstances require it. Mrs. Crispin arranged the funeral. Indeed. Most efficiently, though I remember thinking at the time that it seemed rather a lonely affair. Few mourners, and those mostly neighbors attending from duty rather than affection. Dr. Carfax frowned slightly. There was something else about that day. We'd had quite a severe storm the night before. Wind and rain that left the cemetery in rather poor condition. I expected delays, but everything proceeded normally. Purbright made careful notes. You attended the service yourself? Oh, yes. Felt it was proper. Though I must admit, I left immediately after the religious ceremony. Had other patients waiting and the weather was still threatening. Standard practice, really. Family and close friends typically remain for the interment, but others generally depart after the service. As they walked back toward town, Purbright reflected on Dr. Carfax's account. The storm detail was interesting, though not necessarily significant. What struck him more was the pattern of abbreviated attendance, the sense of a funeral conducted with proper form but minimal personal investment. Their next stop was the undertaking establishment of Rook and Sons, where Mr. Abel Rook received them with the defensive courtesy of someone whose professional reputation had been questioned. He was a man who approached his calling with the gravity it deserved, and any suggestion of irregularity in his services struck him as both personal and professional affront. Inspector, Rook began before Purbright could properly state his business, I understand there have been questions raised about our handling of Mrs. Hartwell's arrangements in 1948. I want to assure you that our records are impeccable and our procedures have never varied from the highest standards. I'm certain they haven't, Mr. Rook. We're simply trying to reconcile some apparent discrepancies in the municipal records. Discrepancies. Rook's tone suggested he found the word personally offensive. Inspector, we provided Mrs. Hartwell with an oak number 3, brass fittings, proper coaches, and full ceremonial attention. Everything was conducted with complete propriety. Your records from that period are still available. Naturally. Though I should mention that the actual interment was handled by Grimsby and Sons. They held the cemetery contract in those days. We provided the service and delivered the deceased to the graveside, but the burial itself was their responsibility. This was new information, and Purbright made note of it. The division of responsibilities might explain certain irregularities, though it also complicated the chain of accountability. Their afternoon was spent with Matthew Ellison, whose father had carved Mrs. Hartwell's headstone and whose recollections provided the most concrete clue yet discovered. The younger Ellison, who had inherited both his father's business and his opinions about proper craftsmanship, examined the cemetery records with professional interest. The Hartwell stone, he mused, consulting his father's meticulous ledgers. Yes, father did that work, though not immediately after the funeral. The order came later, 1952 according to our records. The customer specifically requested the leaf border design, which father always considered rather frivolous for memorial work. The customer being Mrs. Crispin, acting on behalf of the estate. She paid cash and requested that the work be completed when the ground had properly settled, which father interpreted as meaning after the winter frost had finished its work. Sergeant Love looked puzzled. 4 years seems rather a long time to wait for a headstone. Not entirely unusual, Ellison replied. Some families prefer to let grief settle along with the earth. Though father did mention that Mrs. Crispin seemed quite particular about the timing. Said there were family considerations that needed to be resolved first. As evening approached, Purbright found himself in his office, reviewing the day's interviews and considering the pattern that was beginning to emerge. Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell had died alone, been buried with minimal ceremony, and received her headstone 4 years after the fact. The funeral had proceeded normally despite adverse weather conditions, and responsibility for the actual interment had belonged to a different firm than the one that had handled the service. Each detail was perfectly reasonable in isolation, but collectively they suggested something more complex than a straightforward burial. The empty grave was no longer an isolated mystery, but part of a larger puzzle that had been quietly waiting 40 years for someone to notice the missing pieces. "Sergeant," he said as Love prepared to leave for the day, "tomorrow we'll need to speak with Mrs. Crispin, and we should locate the Grimsby records if they still exist. I suspect we'll find that Mrs. Hartwell's story is rather more interesting than her neighbors imagined. Outside, Flaxborough settled into its evening routines, unaware that one of its longest-kept secrets was beginning to stir. In the cemetery, Mrs. Hartwell's headstone maintained its vigil over earth that had never known her presence, while somewhere in the town's collective memory, the truth waited patiently for the right questions to coax it into the light. The morning brought one of those crisp October days when Flaxborough seemed to polish itself for inspection, each shop window gleaming and every doorstep swept with a thoroughness that suggested civic pride was still considered a virtue worth maintaining. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station to find Sergeant Love already installed with tea and a collection of notes that appeared to have multiplied overnight, like particularly industrious rabbits. "Good morning, Sergeant. I trust the local intelligence network has been operating with its usual efficiency." Love looked up with the expression of someone who had spent his morning learning that truth was considerably more flexible than he had previously supposed. "Indeed, sir. It seems Mrs. Hartwell's posthumous reputation has undergone considerable enhancement. Depending on which account one favors, she was either a secret heiress, a foreign agent, or had simply eloped with the milkman and been living quietly in Bournemouth for the past 40 years. The town's imaginative capacity remains admirably robust," Purbright observed, settling at his desk with the satisfaction of someone about to begin a proper day's work. "However, I suspect we'll find more illumination in documented facts than in speculative fiction. Our first call, I believe, should be on Mrs. Amelia Crispin. Dr. Carfax described her as both managing and efficient, a combination that often proves instructive when applied to unusual circumstances. Mrs. Crispin's tea shop occupied the ground floor of a building that had been serving refreshments since Tudor times, though it had adapted to changing tastes with the graceful pragmatism that characterized successful commercial enterprises. The interior suggested a woman who believed that order was not merely preferable to chaos, but was, in fact, a moral obligation. Every napkin was folded with mathematical precision, every sugar cube aligned as if preparing for military inspection. Mrs. Crispin herself embodied these same qualities, a woman of formidable presence whose crisp white apron and perfectly arranged silver hair suggested someone who had never encountered a situation she couldn't organize into submission. She greeted their arrival with a smile that was perfectly polite, while revealing no particular warmth. "Inspector Purbright, Sergeant Love, this is unexpected." Her tone implied that while she valued proper manners, she was also quite aware that police visits rarely involved ordering afternoon tea. "I do hope there's nothing seriously amiss." "Nothing immediate, Mrs. Crispin," Purbright replied with a gentle courtesy that had served him well in countless interviews. "We're making some inquiries regarding Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell, and we understand you were instrumental in her final arrangements back in 1948. A slight tightening around Mrs. Crispin's eyes suggested she found this topic less comfortable than her usual subjects of conversation. Dorothy Hartwell. Good heavens, that was a very long time ago. Such a sad business. She was a dear soul, though terribly private. No family to speak of, poor thing. I simply felt it was my Christian duty to step in when circumstances required it." She gestured toward a corner table that offered both privacy and an excellent view of the street. "Do please sit down. I'll bring you some proper tea. No point discussing such melancholy matters without refreshment." While she busied herself with the tea service, Purbright observed the shop's meticulous organization. The willow and whistle was clearly a testament to Mrs. Crispin's managing efficiency, a quality that Dr. Carfax had noted and which Purbright suspected might extend well beyond the arrangement of teacups. "So you took it upon yourself to arrange Mrs. Hartwell's funeral," he continued once they were settled with tea that was both strong and comforting. "Well, there was no one else, was there?" Mrs. Crispin's voice carried the brisk practicality of someone accustomed to identifying problems and solving them efficiently. Frederick, her husband, had passed some years before, 1943, I believe. They were a quiet couple, kept very much to themselves. When Dorothy fell ill, Doctor. Carfax did his best, but her time came as these things do. It seemed only right that someone should see her off properly. And you handled all the details? The undertaker? The cemetery arrangements? Indeed. Rook and Sons provided excellent service, as they always do. I confirmed the plot in Section C. The Hartwells had maintained a family plot there for generations. I also ensured that Canon Tompkins officiated. He was a lovely man, though quite overwhelmed with duties at the time. Purbright made careful notes, aware that Mrs. Crispin was providing exactly the information they needed, while somehow managing to make each detail sound both complete and slightly rehearsed. You attended the funeral service yourself? Naturally, along with perhaps a dozen others. Neighbors mostly, and a few customers from the shop who had known her. It was a proper service, conducted with appropriate dignity. She paused, stirring her tea with deliberate precision, though I must say the weather that day was quite challenging. We'd had terrible storms the night before, wind and rain that left the cemetery grounds in poor condition. And you remained for the interment? Here, Mrs. Crispin's response came with the confidence of someone who had prepared for this particular question. Of course I did. Someone had to see it through properly. I watched them lower the coffin myself, a very dignified ceremony, considering the difficult conditions. The grave diggers worked as quickly as the weather allowed. After leaving the tea shop, Purbright and Love made their way to the municipal archives, where Sergeant Love's earlier telephone inquiries had located the surviving records of Grimsby and Sons. The ledger, they were shown, was a substantial volume, its pages yellow with age and smelling faintly of the damp storage room where it had waited patiently for someone to ask the right questions. The entry for Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell was written in the careful, copperplate handwriting that characterized professional record-keeping of the era. The basic details matched what they already knew. Section C, Plot 47. Services provided by arrangement with Rook and Sons. However, a small notation in the margin caught Purbright's attention immediately. Delayed by storm damage, he read aloud. Rescheduled for the 18th of March. Sergeant Love looked up from his own notes, his expression thoughtful. But Mrs. Crispin said she witnessed the burial on the day of the service, sir. That would have been the 15th. Indeed, Sergeant. A significant discrepancy. Purbright studied the ledger entry more carefully. According to this record, the actual interment was postponed by 3 days due to ground conditions, which means that Mrs. Crispin could not possibly have witnessed what she claims to have seen. The implications of this discovery settled between them like morning mist, subtle but transformative. Either Mrs. Crispin's memory was playing elaborate tricks, or she had been deliberately misleading them about her role in Mrs. Hartwell's final arrangements. Their final interview of the day was with Mr. Cyril Bream, the solicitor who had handled Mrs. Hartwell's estate. They found him in an office that smelled of old leather and careful attention to detail, surrounded by filing cabinets that appeared to contain the documented sorrows and satisfactions of half the town. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, consulting a file that was notably thin. Yes, I handled the probate. Quite straightforward, really. She died interstate, but her affairs were simple enough. A modest estate, mostly the value of her house and a small insurance policy. We understand there were complications with distant relatives. Mr. Bream's eyebrows rose slightly. Complications? I wouldn't characterize them as such. A second cousin came forward from Leicester, Graham Hartwell, but he was perfectly reasonable about the whole business. Took care of the necessary paperwork and arranged for the house to be sold. No disputes or delays that I recall. This directly contradicted Mrs. Crispin's account of squabbling relatives and financial complications that had delayed the headstone for 4 years. Purbright made careful note of this discrepancy as well. As evening approached, Inspector Purbright found himself in his office, reviewing the day's interviews and considering the pattern that was emerging. Mrs. Crispin had presented herself as the sole witness to Mrs. Hartwell's burial, but the Grimsby records indicated that no burial had taken place on the day she claimed to have witnessed it. She had described complicated family disputes that the solicitor had no memory of and financial delays that seemed to have no basis in documented fact. "Sergeant," he said as Love prepared to leave for the day, "I believe we're beginning to see the outline of something rather more complex than a simple administrative error. Mrs. Crispin appears to have constructed a very detailed account of events that may not have occurred as she described them." "You think she's lying, sir?" "I think she's protecting something, Sergeant. The question is whether she's protecting herself or someone else, or simply protecting the memory of events that she wishes had happened differently." Purbright turned down his desk lamp slightly, as if the case itself might prefer to be discussed in softer light. "Tomorrow, we'll need to speak with the current cemetery keeper again. If Mrs. Hartwell was never actually buried in that plot, then someone has been maintaining a very careful deception for nearly 40 years. Outside, Flaxborough settled into its evening routines, unaware that one of its most respected citizens had just revealed herself to be considerably less reliable than her reputation suggested. In Section C of the municipal cemetery, Mrs. Hartwell's headstone continued its patient vigil over earth that had apparently never known her presence, while somewhere in the town's collective memory, the truth waited for the right combination of questions and persistence to draw it into the light. The morning arrived with a sort of determined grayness that made Flaxborough appear to be wearing its most respectable suit, pressed, proper, and concealing whatever irregularities might lie beneath the surface. Inspector Purbright found Sergeant Love already installed at his desk, with tea, and an expression that suggested the night's reflection had produced more questions than answers. "Good morning, Sergeant. I trust our municipal mystery has continued to evolve in interesting directions." "Indeed, sir. Mr. Merriman telephoned twice before 8 o'clock, and Councillor Kemp has requested an urgent consultation." Love gestured toward a neat stack of messages with the resignation of someone who had learned that urgent consultations rarely involved good news. "It appears the town is developing opinions about our empty grave." Purbright settled into his chair with the deliberate movements of someone who understood that municipal opinions, like weeds, required careful management before they could spread beyond control. "Opinions are the natural product of insufficient information, Sergeant. They flourish in the absence of facts and wither when exposed to inconvenient truths." Their first obligation of the day was a meeting at the town hall where Councillor Kemp had assembled what he described as a coordination committee to address the developing situation. They found him in the council chamber, his considerable bulk arranged behind the official table with the gravity of someone who understood that public problems required public solutions, preferably ones that reflected well on the municipal administration. "Inspector Purbright, thank you for coming so promptly," Kemp began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had spent years learning to sound decisive while avoiding actual decisions. "We've been giving considerable thought to this cemetery business, and I believe we may have identified the source of our difficulties." Mrs. Bracknell sat to his right, her expression suggesting someone who had spent the morning discovering that civic problems were considerably more troublesome than civic ceremonies. Canon Halden occupied the chair to Kemp's left, wearing the patient smile of someone who dealt professionally with mysteries that defied earthly explanation. "The source, Councillor?" Purbright inquired with the polite interest of someone prepared to listen to theories regardless of their merit. "Financial irregularities, Inspector. We've been reviewing the municipal records from 1948, and I'm afraid they reveal a pattern of questionable practices in the handling of burial arrangements for deceased persons without immediate family." Kemp consulted a file with the satisfaction of someone who had discovered a solution that would satisfy both public curiosity and administrative convenience. Mrs. Bracknell leaned forward with the expression of someone delivering uncomfortable but necessary information. "Mrs. Amelia Crispin appears to have been collecting burial fees from various estates while providing incomplete services. The amounts involved are not insignificant. We're speaking of embezzlement, Purbright asked, though his tone suggested he found the accusation less surprising than the officials clearly hoped. We're speaking of a systematic pattern of financial malfeasance that may extend over several years, Kemp replied with the gravity of someone who had found a convenient explanation for an inconvenient problem. Mrs. Crispin was in financial difficulties during that period. Her tea shop was struggling, she was behind on her rent, and she had been denied a bank loan. Then, quite suddenly, her circumstances improved. Canon Holden cleared his throat with clerical delicacy. While we must naturally be cautious about accusations, the timing does appear suggestive. Her involvement in managing the affairs of the deceased coincided remarkably with her financial recovery. The case against Mrs. Crispin, as presented by the municipal authorities, possessed the sort of logical completeness that Purbright had learned to regard with professional skepticism. The motive was clear: financial desperation followed by unexplained prosperity. The opportunity was documented, her role in managing multiple burial arrangements for persons without family oversight. The method was plausible, collecting fees while providing reduced services, confident that the dead could not complain and their distant relatives would never know. A tidy explanation, Purbright observed as they left the town hall. Mrs. Brown. Crispin emerges as both villain and victim, driven to crime by circumstances, but ultimately responsible for her own moral failings. Sergeant Love, who had been taking careful notes throughout the meeting, looked up with the expression of someone wrestling with uncomfortable possibilities. It does seem to fit the facts, sir. Her financial difficulties, her sudden improvement, her involvement in all these burial arrangements, and her claim about witnessing Mrs. Hartwell's interment when the records show it was postponed. Indeed, Sergeant. The pattern is almost suspiciously complete. Purbright paused outside the municipal building, watching the morning traffic navigate the narrow streets with the patient determination that characterized most of Flaxborough's daily business. Which raises the question of whether we're observing a genuine criminal conspiracy or simply the natural human tendency to construct explanations that satisfy our desire for moral clarity. Their return to Mrs. Crispin's tea shop found her in her usual state of organized efficiency, though Purbright detected a subtle tension in her manner that suggested she was aware of the town's shifting opinion regarding her character. The morning customers seemed fewer than usual, and those present conducted their business with the careful politeness that often preceded social ostracism. "Inspector, Sergeant Love," she greeted them with a smile that required slightly more effort than before. "Back again so soon? I do hope you're making progress with your inquiries." "Indeed we are, Mrs. Crispin, though our progress has raised some questions that we hoped you might help us address." Purbright settled into his usual chair with the comfortable patience of someone prepared to spend whatever time was necessary extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. "We've been reviewing the municipal records from 1948, and we've noticed some interesting discrepancies." The slight tightening around Mrs. Crispin's eyes suggested she found this development considerably less welcome than his conversational tone implied. "Discrepancies, Inspector?" "Financial discrepancies, primarily. The burial fees you collected from the various estates you managed don't always correspond to the services that were actually provided." Purbright's voice remained perfectly courteous, though his words carried the weight of official inquiry. "We're hoping you might help us understand these apparent irregularities." Mrs. Crispin's response came with the careful precision of someone who had anticipated this conversation and prepared her defense accordingly. "Inspector, I want you to understand that everything I did was motivated by Christian charity. These poor souls had no one else to care for them, no family to ensure they received proper treatment. If there were administrative complications, they arose from the difficult circumstances of the time, not from any deliberate wrongdoing." "Administrative complications," Purbright repeated thoughtfully. "Could you be more specific about the nature of these complications?" The war had disrupted so many procedures, Inspector. Suppliers were unreliable, services were limited, and the municipal authorities were overwhelmed with more pressing concerns. Sometimes it was necessary to economize in order to ensure that everyone received appropriate care within the available resources. Sergeant Love consulted his notes with the methodical precision of someone building a case from documented facts. Mrs. Ritz. Crispin, our records suggest that you collected full burial fees from several estates while arranging for reduced services. The difference between what you collected and what you paid to the service providers is quite substantial. Substantial enough to resolve your financial difficulties and fund the improvements to your tea shop, Purbright added with gentle persistence. The timing of your recovery coincides remarkably with your increased involvement in managing funeral arrangements. The silence that followed was filled with the comfortable sounds of afternoon trade, the gentle clink of teacups, the rustle of newspapers, the murmured conversations of customers who remained unaware that their favorite establishment had become the center of a criminal investigation. Mrs. Crispin's hands, which had been folding napkins with mechanical precision, stilled completely as she considered her response. "Inspector," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of weary resignation, "I suppose there's no point in denying that I managed certain financial arrangements to everyone's benefit. The deceased received proper services, their estates were settled efficiently, and I was able to continue providing a valuable service to the community. No one was harmed by these arrangements. Except, perhaps, Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell, who appears to have received no service at all," Purbright observed, with a sort of gentle courtesy that made his words more devastating than any accusation. "Her grave, as you know, shows no sign of ever having been opened." Mrs. Crispin's composure finally cracked, revealing the strain that had been building beneath her carefully maintained facade. "Mrs. Hartwell. That was different. That was more complicated than the others." "In what way complicated?" Mrs. Crispin hesitated, clearly struggling with the decision of how much to reveal. She had specific wishes about her final arrangements, wishes that couldn't be accommodated through normal channels. As they prepared to leave, Purbright found himself considering the case that had been constructed against Mrs. Crispin. The evidence was substantial: financial motive, documented opportunity, and a pattern of behavior that suggested systematic fraud. From a procedural standpoint, it was exactly the sort of solution that would satisfy both the municipal authorities and public curiosity. Yet something about Mrs. Crispin's final admission troubled him. Her reference to Mrs. Hartwell's specific wishes suggested complications beyond simple embezzlement, and her obvious distress seemed disproportionate to the relatively modest sums involved in her financial irregularities. "An interesting development, Sergeant," he said as they walked back toward the station. "Mrs. Crispin has essentially admitted to financial impropriety, but her explanation raises more questions than it answers." "You don't think she's our culprit, sir?" "Oh, I'm quite certain she's guilty of something, Sergeant. The question is whether her guilt extends to the matter of Mrs. Hartwell's missing remains, or whether we're observing two separate problems that happen to share the same central figure." Purbright paused to observe a robin investigating the base of a lamp post with the focused attention of a fellow investigator. "Mrs. Crispin's financial arrangements may be irregular, but they don't explain why Mrs. Hartwell's grave was never opened, or why she was so insistent about witnessing an interment that never occurred." By evening, the news of Mrs. Crispin's apparent confession had spread through Flaxborough with the efficiency that characterized all significant local developments. The tea shop had closed early, and several customers had been observed crossing the street to avoid passing too close to what was now being described as the scene of the crime. Yet Inspector Purbright remained unconvinced that they had identified the true source of their mystery. Mrs. Crispin was certainly concealing information, and her financial irregularities provided a convenient explanation for official purposes. But the missing Mrs. Hartwell represented a problem more complex than simple embezzlement, and Purbright suspected that the obvious solution was merely the most visible layer of a more intricate deception. "Tomorrow, Sergeant," he said as Love prepared to leave for the day, "we'll need to explore Mrs. Crispin's reference to Mrs. Hartwell's specific wishes. I suspect we'll discover that our obvious suspect is protecting secrets considerably more interesting than municipal fraud." Outside, Flaxborough settled into its evening routines, satisfied that its mystery was approaching a tidy resolution. Mrs. Crispin had been identified as the culprit, and the town could return to its comfortable assumption that unusual events generally had mundane explanations. Only Inspector Purbright remained convinced that the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove considerably more surprising than anyone currently imagined. The morning arrived with one of those deceptive brightnesses that made Flaxborough appear almost innocent, though Inspector Purbright had long since learned that the town's most interesting secrets were generally concealed beneath its most respectable facades. He found Sergeant Love already installed with tea and a collection of documents that suggested the night's paperwork had been more productive than restful. "Good morning, Sergeant. I trust our municipal mystery continues to reveal new complications with its customary enthusiasm." Love looked up with the expression of someone who had spent his morning discovering that simple questions often produced remarkably complex answers. "Indeed, sir. I've been reviewing the cemetery records more carefully, and I've found something rather peculiar about the timing of Mrs. Hartwell's memorial arrangements." Purbright settled at his desk with the satisfaction of someone about to encounter the sort of trivial detail that often proved more illuminating than dramatic revelations. "Peculiar in what sense?" "The headstone order, sir. Mrs. Crispin claimed she delayed commissioning it because of family complications and financial disputes, but according to Ellison's records, she placed the order in January 1952 and paid for it immediately, in cash, as you'll recall. But here's the interesting part. She specified that the work shouldn't commence until after Easter." "After Easter of 1952? "Precisely, sir. And when I checked the almanac, Easter fell quite late that year, April 13th. So Mrs. Crispin was insisting on a delay of nearly 4 months for work that could have been completed within a few weeks." Love consulted his notes with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to appreciate the significance of seemingly insignificant details. Mr. Ellison's father noted in his ledger that the customer seemed uncommonly particular about the timing, which he found odd enough to record. This detail struck Purbright as precisely the sort of trivial specificity that suggested larger complications lurking beneath the surface of apparently simple arrangements. Mrs. Crispin had been managing not merely a memorial commission, but a carefully orchestrated timeline that seemed to serve purposes beyond mere grief or financial consideration. "An interesting detail, Sergeant. Mrs. Crispin appears to have been managing a rather precise schedule, one that suggests her arrangements were more complex than simple memorial planning would require." He paused, considering the implications. "I believe we should investigate what made the timing so significant. Perhaps the church records might illuminate Mrs. Crispin's unusual scheduling preferences." At All Saints' Church, Canon Haldon received them with the patient courtesy of someone whose professional experience had taught him that earthly mysteries often required both spiritual patience and practical investigation. The phrase "specific wishes" had evidently troubled him as well, for he had already retrieved the relevant parish registers and arranged them on the vestry table with the reverence appropriate to documents that recorded the community's most solemn occasions. "Inspector, Sergeant Love. I've been expecting you, actually. After our conversation about Mrs. Hartwell's specific wishes, I took the liberty of reviewing our burial records from 1948, and I've discovered something that may interest you considerably." He opened a leather-bound register with care, revealing pages filled with the careful handwriting that had preserved decades of the community's final farewells. Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell's funeral service is properly recorded here. March 15th, 1948. Conducted by Canon Tompkins with appropriate ceremony. However, there's an unusual notation in the margin. Purbright leaned forward to examine the entry. The main record was standard: date, officiant, deceased's name, and basic details of the ceremony. But in the margin, written in different ink and clearly added later, was a single word: postponed. Canon Tompkins added that notation himself, Canon Halden explained. I found his personal diary among the church archives, and it provides some illuminating details about that particular day. The diary entry, written in the careful script of someone who believed that daily events deserved proper documentation, described the challenges posed by the severe storm that had struck Flaxborough the night before Mrs. Hartwell's scheduled funeral. Trees had fallen across several roads. The cemetery grounds were waterlogged, and the gravediggers had been unable to complete their preparations. According to Canon Tompkins, the service proceeded as scheduled. Families had traveled from some distance, and rescheduling would have caused considerable inconvenience. However, the actual interment was postponed until ground conditions improved. Canon Halden turned to another page in the diary. But here's where the matter becomes particularly interesting. Canon Tompkins made a follow-up entry 3 days later, noting that Mrs. Crispin had requested that the postponed interment be conducted privately, without family or friends present. She claimed that the deceased had expressed a preference for a simple, unobserved burial. The implications of this discovery settled between them like morning mist, subtle but transformative. Mrs. Crispin had arranged not only for a private interment, but had specifically requested that it proceed without witnesses. This explained her claim about watching the burial, but it also raised profound questions about what had actually occurred during those unsupervised proceedings. So the funeral service took place with proper attendance, but the actual burial was conducted in private 3 days later, Purbright summarized thoughtfully. A rather unusual arrangement, even allowing for difficult weather conditions. Quite unusual, Canon Halden agreed. Canon Tompkins noted that he found the request somewhat irregular, but Mrs. Crispin was quite insistent that it reflected the deceased's wishes for privacy. Their next inquiry led them to Mrs. Elsie Plum, a spry octogenarian who lived 2 doors down from Mrs. Hartwell's former residence on Elm Street. They found her tending to a small garden that suggested someone who believed in maintaining order, even when nature clearly preferred its own arrangements. Dorothy Hartwell. Mrs. Plum's eyes, though aged, sharpened with the effort of recalling a distant past. Poor dear. A very private woman, yes. Kept herself to herself, she did. Not unfriendly, mind you, just self-contained. After her Frederick passed, she retreated even more. Spent most of her time in her garden, or reading. Did she ever speak of her preferences regarding final arrangements? Purbright inquired delicately. Oh, she was quite particular about privacy, Inspector. Valued it above all else, and her possessions too, very particular about her things. Mrs. Plum paused, a slight frown creasing her brow. There was one thing, actually. A small wooden box she always kept on her bedside table locked. Said it contained private papers and was never to be opened by anyone but herself. Quite insistent about it, she was. Even mentioned once that if anyone tried to open it after she was gone, they'd find nothing but dust and disappointment. And what became of this box, Mrs. Plum? That's just it, Inspector. After she passed, when the house was cleared, I never saw it again. Assumed it went with the rest of her personal effects to that cousin of hers, but it always struck me as odd, her being so particular about it, and then it simply vanishing. As they walked back toward the station, Purbright found himself considering how these seemingly disparate details formed a coherent pattern. The delayed headstone commission, timed specifically to commence after Easter 1952, suggested Mrs. Crispin had been managing a careful schedule that extended years beyond the original burial arrangements. The private, unwitnessed interment provided the opportunity for whatever deception had resulted in the empty grave. And Mrs. Hartwell's obsession with privacy, symbolized by her locked box of secrets, suggested someone who might indeed have expressed very specific wishes about her final arrangements. The timing detail regarding the headstone was more significant than it initially appeared, Sergeant, Purbright observed, as they paused outside the municipal building. Mrs. Crispin wasn't simply procrastinating about memorial arrangements. She was ensuring that no one would disturb the burial site until sufficient time had passed for her deception to become undetectable. You believe she never buried Mrs. Hartwell at all, sir? I believe she buried something in that plot, Sergeant, but I'm increasingly convinced it wasn't Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell. The question now is what actually lies beneath that headstone, and why Mrs. Crispin felt compelled to maintain such an elaborate fiction for nearly 40 years. The trivial detail of the Easter deadline had revealed itself as a crucial element in a deception far more complex than simple embezzlement. Mrs. Crispin had been managing not merely funeral arrangements, but a carefully orchestrated timeline designed to conceal the truth about Mrs. Hartwell's actual fate. The empty grave was not an oversight or administrative error, but the centerpiece of a mystery that had been patiently waiting 4 decades for someone to notice the significance of seemingly insignificant scheduling preferences. Tomorrow, Sergeant, Purbright announced as they entered the station, we'll need to determine what became of Mrs. Hartwell's mysterious wooden box. I suspect it contained information that would explain why she required such unconventional final arrangements, and why Mrs. Crispin was willing to risk so much to accommodate her wishes. Outside, Flaxborough continued its gentle evening routines, unaware that a simple question about memorial timing had just unlocked the first piece of a puzzle that would prove considerably more intricate than anyone had yet imagined. In Section C of the cemetery, Mrs. Hartwell's headstone maintained its patient vigil over earth that concealed secrets far more interesting than municipal fraud, while somewhere in the town's documented history, the truth waited for the right combination of persistence and attention to trivial details to draw it into the light. The morning brought one of those tentative brightnesses that made Flaxborough appear almost hopeful, though Inspector Purbright had learned that the town's most interesting secrets were generally concealed beneath its most optimistic expressions. He arrived at the station to find Sergeant Love already installed with tea and a collection of notes that suggested the night's inquiries had attracted the attention of several citizens who had previously considered their memories insufficiently interesting for official purposes. Good morning, Sergeant. I trust our investigation has continued to expand in the manner of a well-tended garden, producing both useful specimens and unexpected varieties. Love gestured toward his accumulated paperwork with the satisfaction of someone who had discovered that asking the right questions often produced more answers than originally requested. Indeed, sir. Word of our inquiries about Mrs. Hartwell's wooden box has stirred up quite a remarkable collection of recollections. It appears that several people remember details they hadn't considered significant until now. The prospect of being involved in a genuine mystery often improves people's memory considerably, Purbright observed, settling at his desk with the anticipation of someone about to encounter the sort of human complexity that made detective work both challenging and instructive. What manner of revelations have emerged from our expanding field of witnesses? Their first call of the day led them to Pargeter and Company, auction rooms where Mr. Felix Pargeter received them in a waistcoat of such determined cheerfulness that it seemed to have been tailored from pure optimism. He possessed the air of someone who had spent decades proving that one person's discarded possession was invariably another person's treasure, provided the price was negotiated with appropriate enthusiasm. Inspector Purbright, a pleasure to assist the forces of order. We are purveyors only of legitimate memories, I assure you. His eyes brightened with the anticipation of someone who had rarely encountered a question about his professional activities that wasn't preceded by accusations. "How may I illuminate your inquiries?" "We're revisiting a house sale from 1948, Mr. Pargeter. The estate of Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell, Elm Street. We are particularly interested in whether a small wooden box or casket was among the items catalogued." "Ah, the Hartwell clearance." Pargeter's expression grew thoughtful as he consulted his mental inventory of decades of accumulated transactions. "Plain but honest furnishings, as I recall. Nothing spectacular, but everything solid and properly maintained. Miss Dalrymple, if you would be so kind, Ledger F, Household Sales 1947 to 1952. Miss Dalrymple materialized with the efficiency of someone who had spent her professional life proving that proper record-keeping was the foundation of civilized commerce. She approached the ledger with the reverence others reserved for religious texts, turning its pages with the careful attention such documents deserved. "Here we are," she announced with satisfaction. "Lot 34, mixed china and ornamental items. Lot 35, tea caddy, cedar wood with mother-of-pearl inlay, damaged hinge." She paused, consulting her notes with the precision of someone who believed that details mattered. The tea caddy went to Mr. Viles at the General Hall, Wharf End. Paid 2 shillings and 6pence, which was generous considering the condition. Enoch Viles' establishment occupied a corner near the canal, where objects migrated to spend their retirement among companions of similar, improbable survival. It possessed the comfortable disorder of a place where useful things waited patiently for someone to rediscover their purpose. Mr. Viles himself embodied the same philosophy. A man who had learned that patience and curiosity were more valuable than haste and assumption. "Tea caddy, you say?" Viles repeated, his expression suggesting someone who had handled enough mysterious containers to appreciate their potential for both disappointment and revelation. "Cedar wood with mother-of-pearl work?" I remember it well. Pretty little thing, though the hinge needed attention." "Do you recall anything unusual about the caddy, Mr. Viles?" "Well," Viles said, adjusting his cap to a more comfortable position for serious conversation. It felt heavier than its size suggested, which usually means someone's been using it for storage rather than tea. "When I examined it properly, I found it had a false bottom, glued and nailed as if whoever sealed it wanted to discourage casual investigation." Purbright leaned forward with the interest of someone who had learned to appreciate the significance of careful concealment. "And did you investigate further?" "Professional curiosity, Inspector. I prized it open carefully, but found only the impression of something that had once been there. A rectangular outline in the wood, as if papers had been stored there for some time and then removed." Viles paused thoughtfully. "Sold the caddy to Miss Laker. She collects such things. But whatever had been hidden in it was long gone by the time it reached my shop." Miss Ursula Laker lived in a cottage that demonstrated the comfortable accumulation of someone who had spent decades appreciating objects that others considered merely functional. She received them with the patient courtesy of someone who had learned that visitors with questions about her collections generally brought more interesting conversation than those seeking only tea and sympathy. "The cedar wood caddy?" "Certainly, Inspector. A charming piece despite Mr. Viles' investigation of its secrets." She produced the item with the careful movements of someone who understood that age required respectful handling. I was rather disappointed that he had already discovered and emptied the hidden compartment, but the craftsmanship itself was worth preserving. The caddy was indeed a modest but well-made piece, its mother-of-pearl inlay dulled by age but still suggesting the care with which it had been originally selected. The false bottom, as Viles had described, showed clear evidence of having been opened, revealing the faint outline where papers had once rested. "Miss Laker," Purbright inquired gently, "do you happen to recall when Mr. Viles mentioned acquiring this piece?" "Oh, yes. He was quite specific about the timing. said it came from a house clearance in late March 1948, but that the original owner had been particular about privacy. He seemed to find that rather amusing, though I've always thought privacy was an admirable quality in an increasingly intrusive world. Their afternoon brought them to Mr. Arthur Grimble, a retired railway clerk who had contacted the station with information about unusual postal arrangements from the same period. They found him in a cottage that suggested someone who had applied the same methodical precision to his retirement that he had brought to decades of managing other people's travel requirements. Inspector Purbright, I understand you've been inquiring about Mrs. Hartwell's personal effects. I may have information that bears directly on your investigation. Grimble consulted a small notebook with the satisfaction of someone who had never discarded a potentially useful record. In April 1948, approximately a month after Mrs. Hartwell's funeral, Mrs. Crispin came to the railway station with a package she wanted held for delayed posting. Delayed posting, Mr. Grimble. Most unusual arrangement, Inspector. She wanted the package stored at the station for exactly 4 years, then posted to an address in Leicester. Payment was made in advance, including storage fees. She was quite insistent that the arrangement be handled with complete discretion. This detail connected directly to Mrs. Crispin's careful timing of the headstone commission, suggesting a coordinated plan that extended years beyond the original funeral arrangements. And the package was dispatched as requested? April 1952, just after Easter, exactly as arranged. Mrs. Crispin came personally to confirm that it had been sent. I remember thinking at the time that it was rather an elaborate way to handle what she described as family papers, but customers' arrangements were their own concern. Their final interview of the day was with Lionel Grimsby, the surviving member of Grimsby and Sons, who had been a young assistant during the period in question. They found him in a yard that had become an informal museum of tools and equipment that had outlived their original purposes, surrounded by the comfortable decay of a business that had adapted to changing times by accepting that some changes were beyond accommodation. You were asking about 1948, Grimsby said after Purbright had explained their interest in Mrs. Hartwell's burial arrangements. I was just a lad then, fetch and carry mostly, but I remember the storm that postponed several burials. Mrs. Hartwell's was one of them. And it was completed 3 days later, on the 18th of March. Grimsby's expression grew thoughtful, the look of someone sorting through memories that had been stored without particular organization. According to our ledger, yes. But I remember something else about that job. There was a conversation between my father and Mrs. Crispin, quiet, but I was close enough to hear some of it. What sort of conversation, Mr. Vra? Grimsby. She had specific requirements about the burial. Said the deceased had expressed wishes for complete privacy, no service, no witnesses, minimal ceremony. My father pointed out that we still needed to dig and fill the grave properly, and she said something odd. You make the ground look as if the burial had happened. We'll handle the rest. The implications of this revelation settled over them like morning mist. Subtle but transformative. Mrs. Crispin had arranged not merely for a private burial, but for the appearance of a burial while managing the actual disposition of the remains through entirely different means. Mr. Grimsby, are you saying that no actual interment took place? I'm saying my father was paid to prepare a gravesite and make it appear used, Inspector. Where the coffin went after the postponed service, that wasn't our concern. Though I do remember him mentioning something about a crematorium permit. Said it was unusual paperwork for our line of work. As evening approached, Purbright found himself reviewing the day's discoveries and considering how the expanding field of characters had revealed a deception far more elaborate than simple municipal fraud. Mrs. Hartwell's wooden box had been transformed into a tea caddy, its contents carefully removed and stored at the railway station for 4 years before being forwarded to her Leicester relative. The burial arrangements had been a carefully orchestrated performance, designed to satisfy public expectations while concealing the actual disposition of the remains. "We're no longer investigating a missing body, Sergeant," he observed as Love prepared to leave for the day. "We're investigating a conspiracy that involved multiple participants and extended over several years. Mrs. Crispin was not acting alone, and her arrangements were designed to satisfy someone's very specific requirements for privacy." "Mrs. Hartwell's own requirements, sir." "That seems most likely, Sergeant, though the question remains why she felt such elaborate deception was necessary, and what information was important enough to justify maintaining this fiction for nearly 40 years. Purbright turned down his desk lamp slightly, as if the mystery itself preferred to be discussed in softer light. "Tomorrow, we'll need to contact the Leicester address and determine what Mrs. Hartwell's papers revealed when they finally reached their intended destination." Outside, Flaxborough settled into its evening routines, unaware that its investigation had expanded to include a network of cooperating citizens who had maintained one of the town's most carefully guarded secrets. In Section C of the cemetery, Mrs. Hartwell's headstone continued its patient vigil over earth that had never known her presence, while somewhere in the community's collective memory, the truth waited for the right combination of persistence and systematic investigation to draw it into the light. The morning brought one of those deceptive clarities that made Flaxborough appear almost virtuous, though Inspector Purbright had learned that the town's most interesting revelations generally arrived disguised as routine administrative matters. He found Sergeant Love already installed with tea and a collection of documents that suggested the night's correspondence had produced more answers than originally requested, though not necessarily the answers they had expected to receive. "Good morning, Sergeant. I trust our investigation continues to evolve in directions that illuminate while simultaneously complicating our understanding of human nature." Love gestured toward a letter bearing the Leicester postmark, with the expression of someone who had discovered that simple questions often produced remarkably complex answers. "Indeed, sir. We've received a most illuminating response from Mr. Graham Hartwell regarding the package Mrs. Crispin arranged to have sent to him in 1952. His account transforms our entire understanding of Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell's final arrangements. The letter, written in the careful script of someone accustomed to handling family matters with appropriate discretion, provided details that shifted their investigation from a case of missing remains to something far more psychologically intricate. Mr. Hartwell explained that the delayed package had contained not only Mrs. Hartwell's personal effects, but a detailed letter outlining her specific instructions for what he described as rather unconventional final arrangements, motivated by deeply personal considerations. According to Mr. Hartwell, Love continued, consulting his notes with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to appreciate the significance of seemingly insignificant details, Mrs. Hartwell specifically requested cremation rather than burial, and insisted that the existence of this cremation be concealed from the general public. She wanted people to believe she had been buried in the family plot, but she wanted no actual grave that could be visited. An interesting preference, Sergeant. Did Mr. Hartwell's letter explain the reasoning behind these unusual wishes? It did, sir. Mrs. Hartwell was concerned about a particular individual who she believed might attempt to visit her grave. Someone she described as having forfeited any right to pay respects through his conduct during her lifetime. Love paused, clearly wrestling with the delicate nature of the information. She specifically mentioned a Mr. Timothy Finch, who was apparently a prominent member of the community during the 1940s. This revelation provided the missing piece that transformed their understanding of the entire affair. Mrs. Hartwell's empty grave was not the result of criminal negligence or embezzlement, but a carefully orchestrated deception designed to deny a specific individual the opportunity to publicly mourn her. The elaborate arrangements involving Mrs. Crispin, the delayed headstone, and the 4-year postponement of the revealing letter all served a single purpose: ensuring that Timothy Finch would find no physical location where he could demonstrate his grief or maintain any connection to her memory. So Mrs. Crispin was not embezzling from the deceased, Purbright observed, with the satisfaction of someone whose skepticism about obvious solutions had been vindicated. She was fulfilling the specific wishes of someone who wanted to control her posthumous reputation with the same precision she had apparently applied to her living arrangements. Their morning was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Pegg, whose expression suggested he had discovered something that required immediate attention from people who specialized in unusual circumstances. He entered their office with the deliberate movements of someone who had spent 30 years learning that the earth occasionally revealed secrets that challenged conventional assumptions about proper burial procedures. "Inspector," he began without preamble, "I found evidence of recent disturbance at the Hartwell plot. Someone's been trying to lift the stone again, more carefully this time, but they left scratches on the curbing that weren't there yesterday. Also found bicycle tracks near the west gate, and what looks like paper ash scattered in the grass nearby. This physical evidence suggested that someone had learned of their investigation and was attempting to eliminate traces of the original deception. The timing indicated that their inquiries had made someone nervous enough to risk nocturnal cemetery visits in an attempt to conceal evidence that had remained undisturbed for nearly 40 years. Interesting timing, Mr. Pegg. Someone appears to believe that our investigation might uncover information they prefer to keep buried, if you'll forgive the expression. Their next inquiry led them to the Flaxborough Municipal Crematorium, where the superintendent received them with the patient courtesy of someone whose professional experience had taught him that official inquiries generally involved checking records that had been properly maintained but rarely consulted. The crematorium's ledgers, though meticulously kept, were consulted far less frequently than the cemetery's burial records. Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell, March 1948, the superintendent repeated, consulting his records with the satisfaction of someone whose filing system had never failed to produce requested information. Cremated on March 16th, the day after the funeral service. Ashes collected by Mrs. Amelia Crispin on March 18th, the same day the burial was supposed to have taken place at the cemetery. The timing confirmed their suspicions perfectly. Mrs. Hartwell had been cremated the day after her funeral service, while the community believed she was awaiting burial that had been postponed due to weather conditions. Mrs. Crispin had collected the ashes on the very day she supposedly supervised an interment that never occurred, completing a deception that had satisfied public expectations while fulfilling the deceased's actual wishes. As they returned to the station, Purbright found himself considering the psychological complexity of Mrs. Hartwell's final arrangements. The elaborate deception had been motivated not by financial gain or criminal intent, but by a desire to control her posthumous reputation and deny a specific individual the satisfaction of public mourning. It was a crime of passion committed from beyond the grave, orchestrated with the precision of someone who understood that revenge, properly planned, could be both subtle and enduring. "The question now, Sergeant," he observed as they settled back into their office, "is what Mr. Timothy Finch did to earn such elaborate posthumous disapproval. Mrs. Hartwell went to considerable trouble to ensure he would find no grave to visit, no physical location where he could demonstrate whatever grief or regret he might have felt. You think he's still alive, sir? That would add considerable complexity to the situation, Sergeant. A man who discovers that someone has gone to such lengths to deny him the opportunity to pay his respects might feel compelled to investigate the circumstances himself." Purbright paused, considering the implications. "The recent disturbance at the cemetery suggests that someone with detailed knowledge of the original deception is concerned about our investigation. Someone who understands exactly what we might discover if we continue asking the right questions." The second incident had transformed their investigation from a straightforward case of municipal irregularities into something far more psychologically intricate. Mrs. Hartwell's empty grave was revealed as the centerpiece of a carefully planned act of posthumous revenge, designed to deny a specific individual any opportunity to publicly mourn her or maintain any connection to her memory. The financial irregularities that had initially seemed central to the case were merely the administrative byproducts of a deception motivated by deeply personal considerations. "Tomorrow, Sergeant," Purbright announced as Love prepared to leave for the day. "We'll need to learn more about the late Mr. Timothy Finch and his relationship with Mrs. Hartwell. I suspect we'll discover that Flaxborough's most respectable citizens occasionally possessed private lives considerably less admirable than their public reputations suggested." Outside, Flaxborough settled into its evening routines, unaware that one of its longest-kept secrets had finally been revealed. The empty grave was no longer a mystery, but a monument to the enduring power of carefully planned revenge. While somewhere in the town's collective memory, the truth about Timothy Finch waited patiently for the right questions to draw it into the light. The second incident had shifted their investigation entirely. From seeking a missing body to understanding a missing relationship, from investigating a crime against the dead to exploring a crime committed by the dead against the living. Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell, it appeared, had achieved in death what she had perhaps been unable to accomplish in life, the complete and final rejection of someone who had forfeited any claim to her memory. The evening had settled over Flaxborough with the comfortable weight of a well-ordered day, though Inspector Purbright found himself in his office well past the hour when most sensible citizens had retired to their domestic concerns. The case of Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell's elaborate posthumous deception had reached that peculiar stage where individual facts had accumulated into a coherent pattern, yet the human motivations behind that pattern remained as mysterious as they had been when Mr. Peg first lifted a headstone to reveal undisturbed earth. Purbright sat in the gentle circle of his desk lamp, surrounded by documents that told a story of remarkable psychological complexity. Mrs. Hartwell had orchestrated her deception with the precision of someone who understood that revenge, properly planned, could transcend the limitations of mortality. She had arranged for her remains to be cremated while maintaining the fiction of burial, ensuring that Timothy Finch would find no grave to visit, no physical location where he could demonstrate whatever remorse or affection he might have felt. The psychology of such elaborate revenge fascinated him. What manner of injury could justify such calculated denial of closure? So, Mrs. Hartwell had been, by all accounts, a quiet and private woman who had lived unremarkably among her neighbors. Yet beneath this respectable facade, she had harbored resentments powerful enough to motivate a conspiracy that had operated successfully for nearly 40 years. Her revenge was not the product of casual resentment, but of deep and enduring pain that had shaped her final months and influenced her most important decisions. The role of Mrs. Crispin in this affair was equally intriguing. She had agreed to become the primary custodian of Mrs. Hartwell's secret, accepting responsibility for maintaining a deception that could have destroyed her reputation if discovered. The financial irregularities that had initially seemed central to the case were revealed as merely incidental. Mrs. Crispin had indeed profited from her management of various funeral arrangements, but her involvement in Mrs. Hartwell's case appeared motivated by compassion rather than greed. What manner of story had Mrs. Hartwell told to secure such devoted assistance? The question of Timothy Finch himself remained the most pressing aspect of the investigation. The recent disturbance at the cemetery indicated that someone with detailed knowledge of the original deception was concerned about their inquiries. This person understood exactly what evidence might be discovered and had taken considerable risk to attempt its concealment. The bicycle tracks and paper ash suggested someone who had arrived quietly, attempted to destroy documentary evidence, and departed with equal discretion. Purbright reached for the municipal records that Sergeant Love had retrieved from the archives. The Flaxborough Chronicle files from the 1940s revealed Timothy Finch as a man of considerable civic prominence, chairman of various committees, a frequent speaker at public events, photographed regularly with other municipal worthies. He had died in 1969, according to Mr. Merriman's recollections, leaving behind a son who operated a bicycle shop on Beckett Lane. Edwin Finch. The name had emerged during their afternoon inquiries as someone who objected to the expense of petrol on moral grounds and insisted upon cycling everywhere. A man who would possess both the means and the local knowledge necessary for nocturnal visits to the cemetery. More significantly, a man who might have discovered his father's connection to Mrs. Hartwell and felt compelled to protect the family reputation from posthumous scandal. The evidence linking Edwin Finch to the recent disturbance was circumstantial but compelling. The bicycle tracks at the west gate matched the pattern of someone arriving and departing by the most discreet route. The paper ash suggested the destruction of documents, perhaps letters or other communications that might illuminate the true nature of Timothy Finch's relationship with Mrs. Hartwell. Most tellingly, the timing of the disturbance coincided precisely with their investigation's focus on the Hartwell case. Purbright considered the moral complexity of the situation. Mrs. Hartwell's deception was simultaneously admirable and disturbing. Admirable for its careful planning and successful execution, disturbing for its calculated cruelty and enduring consequences. She had achieved a form of justice that transcended conventional legal remedies, but she had done so through means that challenged fundamental assumptions about forgiveness and closure. The case revealed the capacity of ordinary people to maintain extraordinary secrets when they believed those secrets served legitimate purposes. Mrs. Crispin, the crematorium superintendent, and others had all participated in or facilitated the deception, yet none had apparently considered it their responsibility to reveal the truth. They had accepted that Mrs. Hartwell's wishes deserved respect, even when those wishes involved elaborate deception and the denial of conventional burial rites. The recent attempt to disturb the evidence suggested that Edwin Finch feared the consequences of revelation. He understood that the truth about Mrs. Hartwell's deception might damage his father's posthumous reputation or reveal information that had remained successfully concealed for 4 decades. His discovery that police attention had focused on the Hartwell plot might have prompted him to attempt the destruction of any remaining evidence that could link his father to the empty grave. The irony was profound. Timothy Finch might have spent years visiting what he believed to be Mrs. Hartwell's grave, unaware that his attempts at posthumous reconciliation were being frustrated by her careful planning. His son, discovering this deception, had chosen to protect his father's memory by attempting to conceal evidence of the relationship that had motivated such elaborate revenge. As Purbright prepared to leave his office, he reflected on the investigation's evolution from a simple case of municipal irregularities into a profound exploration of human nature in its most calculating aspects. Tomorrow would bring the final phase, a careful conversation with Edwin Finch that would reveal whether his suspicions were justified and whether the son was indeed protecting secrets that the father had carried to his grave. The case demonstrated the enduring power of carefully planned revenge and the willingness of communities to protect individuals whose private arrangements challenged conventional expectations. Mrs. Hartwell had succeeded in denying Timothy Finch the conventional rites of closure, but her success had created new complications for the living, forcing his son to choose between revelation and concealment. Outside, Flaxborough slept peacefully, unaware that one of its longest-kept secrets was approaching its final revelation. In Section C of the cemetery, Mrs. Hartwell's headstone continued its patient vigil over earth that had never known her presence, while somewhere in the town's collective memory, the complete truth about Timothy Finch waited for the right combination of persistence and careful questioning to draw it into the light. "Tomorrow, Sergeant," he murmured to the empty office, "we shall discover whether a bicycle shop proprietor's devotion to his father's memory extends to the destruction of evidence, and whether Mrs. Hartwell's revenge has claimed a second generation as its unwitting victim." The morning arrived with one of those deceptive clarities that made Flaxborough appear almost virtuous, though Inspector Purbright had learned that the town's most carefully guarded secrets were generally concealed beneath its most respectable facades. He found Sergeant Love already installed with tea and an expression that suggested the night's preparation had been more strategic than restful. "Good morning, Sergeant. I trust our investigation has reached that delicate stage where truth must be coaxed from reluctant witnesses through the careful application of what we might charitably call psychological encouragement." Love consulted his notes with the satisfaction of someone who had spent his morning learning to appreciate the theatrical aspects of detective work. "Indeed, sir. The evidence linking Edwin Finch to our cemetery disturbance is compelling but circumstantial. We'll need to encourage him to reveal his involvement without providing him the opportunity to construct alternative explanations." "Quite right, Sergeant. The art of successful interrogation lies not in dramatic confrontation, but in creating circumstances where truth becomes more comfortable than continued deception." Purbright settled at his desk with the anticipation of someone about to apply decades of experience to a problem that required both patience and precision. "I believe we should approach Mr. Finch in his natural environment, where he feels secure in his routines and confident in his ability to manage unexpected questions." Finch's cycles occupied a corner shop that possessed the comfortable disorder of a place where useful objects waited patiently for someone to rediscover their purpose. The interior bore the accumulated wisdom of decades spent proving that proper maintenance was more valuable than fashionable appearance, surrounded by bicycles in various stages of mechanical redemption. Edwin Finch himself embodied the same philosophy. A lean, methodical man who approached problems with the systematic precision that characterized those who understood that most difficulties could be resolved through careful attention to detail. "Inspector Purbright, Sergeant Love." He greeted them with the cautious courtesy of someone who had never expected police attention but understood that cooperation was generally preferable to resistance. "This is unexpected. Nothing serious, I hope." "Nothing immediate, Mr. Finch," Purbright replied, settling into a chair with the deliberate movements of someone prepared to spend whatever time was necessary extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. "We're making some inquiries about local history, and we thought you might assist us with certain questions about your father's generation." The slight tightening around Finch's eyes suggested he found this topic considerably less comfortable than bicycle maintenance. "Local history, Inspector? I'm afraid I'm more familiar with mechanical problems than historical ones. Perhaps you could help us with some questions about municipal affairs in the 1940s. Purbright continued with the gentle persistence that had served him well in countless interviews. "We're investigating some irregularities in burial records from that period, and we understand your father was quite prominent in civic matters during those years." "My father was indeed active in community service," Finch replied with the careful precision of someone who had anticipated this conversation and prepared his responses accordingly. "Though I'm not certain how his civic activities might relate to cemetery matters." Purbright's approach was deliberately indirect, designed to create the impression of routine inquiry, while gradually narrowing the focus toward the specific information he required. "We've been particularly interested in the case of Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell, who died in 1948. Her burial arrangements involved some unusual complications that we're trying to understand." The mention of Mrs. Hartwell's name produced a visible reaction, a slight stiffening of posture that suggested both recognition and profound discomfort. "Mrs. Hartwell. I'm afraid I don't recall my father mentioning anyone by that name." "That's interesting, Mr. Finch, because our investigation suggests that your father knew Mrs. Hartwell quite intimately. Intimately enough, in fact, that she took considerable trouble to ensure he would never be able to visit her grave." Purbright's tone remained perfectly conversational, though his words carried the weight of accumulated evidence. She arranged to be cremated while maintaining the fiction of burial, specifically to deny him the opportunity to pay his respects. The silence that followed was filled with the comfortable sounds of the bicycle shop, the gentle tick of a wheel spinning freely, the rustle of papers disturbed by the afternoon breeze, the distant murmur of traffic negotiating the narrow streets. Finch's hands, which had been adjusting a brake cable with automatic precision, stilled completely as he considered his response. "Inspector," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of weary resignation, "I suppose there's no point in pretending I don't understand what you're suggesting. Yes, I knew about Mrs. Hartwell's arrangements. I discovered them quite by accident several years ago, when I was researching family history. And how did you react to this discovery, Mr. Finch?" I was disturbed, confused. My father had never mentioned Mrs. Hartwell, yet she had apparently harbored such resentment toward him that she arranged an elaborate deception to deny him even the basic courtesy of paying his respects. Finch set down his tools with the careful movements of someone who had decided that honesty was preferable to continued evasion. I spent considerable time trying to understand what might have motivated such extreme measures. Purbright leaned forward slightly, sensing that they had reached the crucial moment where careful questioning might finally reveal the truth that had been concealed for nearly 40 years. "And did your research illuminate the nature of their relationship?" "It did, Inspector, though the truth was more complicated than I had expected." Finch consulted a small notebook with the reluctant satisfaction of someone who had spent years documenting uncomfortable facts. My father and Mrs. Hartwell had been romantically involved during the early 1940s. She was a widow. He was recently divorced from my mother. Their relationship lasted approximately 2 years. And what terminated this relationship, Mr. Finch? My father's political ambitions, Inspector. The words came with obvious difficulty, as if each syllable carried the weight of accumulated shame. He was seeking election to the town council, and his political advisers convinced him that his association with Mrs. Hartwell might damage his prospects. She was considered unsuitable for someone with municipal aspirations. The complete picture finally emerged with the devastating clarity that Purbright had been seeking throughout their investigation. Timothy Finch had abandoned Mrs. Hartwell not for reasons of incompatibility or natural conclusion, but for the calculated advancement of his political career. Her elaborate posthumous revenge had been motivated not by casual resentment, but by the profound betrayal of someone who had trusted him with her affections and been discarded when those affections became politically inconvenient. "So he ended their relationship quite abruptly?" Purbright inquired, with a gentle persistence that encouraged complete confession. "Without explanation or apology, Inspector. Simply stopped calling on her and began courting the woman who became his second wife. Mrs. Hartwell was left to understand that she had been expendable." Finch's voice carried a note of shame that suggested he found his father's behavior as distressing as Mrs. Hartwell apparently had. She had trusted him, and he betrayed that trust for the sake of municipal respectability. The psychological complexity of Mrs. Hartwell's revenge now became fully apparent. She had crafted a deception that would deny Timothy Finch any opportunity for posthumous redemption, ensuring that his attempts at making amends would be frustrated by her careful planning. It was revenge of remarkable sophistication, patient, complete, and enduring. "And your father never learned of her deception?" Purbright asked. "He spent years visiting what he believed to be her grave, Inspector. Bringing flowers, apparently seeking some form of absolution for his behavior. He never knew that his attempts at reconciliation were being frustrated by her elaborate planning." Finch straightened slightly, as if confession were restoring some measure of dignity to his position. In a way, she achieved perfect justice, denying him the peace he sought while ensuring he would never understand why. "Which brings us to your recent activities." Mr. Finch Purbright's tone remained gentle, but his words carried unmistakable authority. "We have evidence that someone attempted to disturb the Hartwell plot several nights ago, possibly to destroy documentary evidence. Would you care to explain your involvement in that incident?" Finch's response came with the relief of someone who had carried an uncomfortable secret for too long. "Yes, Inspector. When I learned of your investigation, I became concerned that the truth about my father's relationship with Mrs. Hartwell might become public knowledge. I attempted to remove some letters that I had discovered among his personal effects, letters that documented their relationship and his reasons for ending it. The paper ash that Mr. Pegg discovered near the West Gate. I was not entirely successful in destroying the evidence, Inspector. The letters were too well preserved to burn completely in the time I had available. I suspect you'll find the remains quite legible, should you choose to examine them." Finch met Purbright's gaze directly, as if honesty had finally freed him from the burden of concealment. "I realize now that attempting to hide the truth was both futile and inappropriate. My father's behavior was his responsibility, not mine." As they prepared to leave the bicycle shop, Purbright found himself reflecting on the case's evolution from a simple administrative irregularity into a profound exploration of human nature in its most calculating and vulnerable aspects. Mrs. Hartwell's revenge had been both cruel and understandable, while Edwin Finch's attempt to protect his father's memory had been both misguided and touching. "An interesting conclusion to our test, Sergeant," he observed as they walked back toward the station. "We've discovered that posthumous revenge can be both elegant and enduring, and that the sins of fathers can indeed be visited upon their children, though not always in the manner that Scripture suggests. What will happen to Mr. Finch, sir? I believe his cooperation and genuine remorse will weigh heavily in his favor, Sergeant. His crime was motivated by filial loyalty rather than personal gain, and his attempt to destroy evidence was both unsuccessful and ultimately unnecessary." Purbright paused to observe a robin investigating the base of a lamp-post with the focused attention of a fellow investigator. "Mrs. Hartwell's revenge has finally run its course. The truth she sought to conceal has been revealed, and the man she sought to punish has been dead for 25 years. Perhaps it's time for both justice and mercy to declare victory and retire from the field." The test had succeeded in ways that extended far beyond the simple confirmation of Edwin Finch's involvement in the cemetery disturbance. It had revealed the complete truth about Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell's elaborate deception and the profound human motivations that had sustained it for nearly 40 years. Timothy Finch had abandoned love for political advancement, and Mrs. Hartwell had crafted a revenge that transcended the conventional limitations of mortality. Their son had attempted to protect a memory that perhaps deserved no protection, while Mrs. Crispin had faithfully maintained a secret that honored both friendship and the complex demands of justice. Outside, Flaxborough continued its gentle afternoon routines, unaware that one of its longest-kept secrets had finally been revealed through the patient application of careful questions and persistent investigation. The empty grave had served its purpose, denying Timothy Finch the closure he had sought, while ensuring that his son would eventually face the consequences of his father's choices. Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell, it appeared, had achieved a form of justice that transcended both death and the conventional limitations of human revenge. The test was complete, the truth revealed, and Inspector Purbright could return to his quiet paperwork, with the satisfaction of someone who had once again proven that human nature, however complex, could be understood through patience, observation, and the careful application of persistent inquiry. The dead, it seemed, were quite capable of achieving their own justice, provided they possessed sufficient determination and the assistance of friends willing to honor their most unconventional wishes. The corn exchange had been arranged with the sort of determined propriety that suggested a community preparing to confront uncomfortable truths while maintaining its dignity. Mrs. Ida Bracknell occupied her customary position with the expression of someone who had spent 7 years learning that municipal problems rarely possessed the simple solutions that citizens preferred. Councillor Kemp had arranged himself with the gravity of a man who understood that this briefing might require delicate handling if it were to reflect favorably on the town's administrative competence. Canon Holden sat between duty and curiosity, his clerical composure suggesting someone whose professional experience had taught him that earthly mysteries often required both spiritual patience and practical investigation. Mr. Merriman clutched his files with the desperate hope that proper documentation might yet impose order on circumstances that had proven remarkably resistant to bureaucratic control. Mrs. Amelia Crispin had taken a chair slightly apart from the others, her usual efficiency tempered by a weariness that suggested the burden of maintaining secrets for nearly 40 years. Edwin Finch occupied a position near the door, his bicycle clip still visible above his shoes, a detail that Inspector Purbright found both touching and incriminating in equal measure. Inspector Purbright declined the head of the room and chose instead a position where he could observe faces without making a theatrical production of the proceedings. Sergeant Love, looking as if he had spent the morning memorizing the complete municipal history of Flaxborough, took a discreet chair nearby with his notebook prepared for the sort of careful documentation that would satisfy both official requirements and human curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Purbright began with the measured courtesy that had served him well in countless explanations of human behavior that defied conventional expectations. "Our investigation into the apparent irregularities in Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell's burial arrangements has revealed a situation of considerable psychological complexity, though one that reflects more favorably on our community's character than initially appeared possible." He paused, allowing this reassuring observation to settle before continuing with the more challenging details. "To begin with the essential facts, we have an empty grave. Mr. Pegg's observation that the earth beneath Mrs. Hartwell's headstone was undisturbed has been corroborated by the nature of the soil, by the absence of subsidence, and by the simple application of common sense to uncommon circumstances." The committee leaned forward slightly, sensing that the moment for speculation had passed and the time for revelation had arrived. In March 1948, a severe storm delayed several burials, Mrs. Hartwell's among them. The Grimsby and Sons ledger notes the postponement, and Canon Tompkins added the same notation to the church register in his characteristically neat handwriting. Purbright consulted his notes with the careful attention of someone who understood that complex truths required precise presentation. Yet the burial never occurred. The municipal crematorium records show that Mrs. Hartwell was cremated on March 16, 1948, the day after her funeral service. Her ashes were collected by Mrs. Crispin on March 18th, the very day when, in public imagination, shovels were scraping clay in Section C of the cemetery. Canon Holden made a small sound that might have been relief. Theologians, as a professional class, understand the power of symbols, and he was beginning to appreciate the elegant completeness of Mrs. Hartwell's arrangements. "The question, then," Purbright continued, "is not where Mrs. Hartwell lies, but why the town was invited to believe she lay elsewhere. The answer begins with a wooden box, proceeds through a tea caddy, and concludes with a remarkable act of posthumous justice that has operated successfully for nearly 40 years. Mrs. Crispin's hands, which had been folding a handkerchief with mechanical precision, stilled completely as Purbright outlined the careful choreography of deception that she had maintained with such devoted discretion. Mrs. Hartwell's personal effects were stored in a small cedarwood box with a false bottom, a detail that proved significant when the box was transformed into a tea caddy during the house clearance. The papers it originally contained were removed by Mrs. Crispin and held at the railway station under an arrangement for delayed posting. 4 years later, in April 1952, these papers were sent to Mrs. Hartwell's cousin in Leicester, explaining her unconventional final arrangements and the reasons that had motivated them. He turned slightly toward Mrs. Crispin, his voice carrying a note of professional admiration for such methodical planning. The timing was crucial. Mrs. Crispin delayed commissioning the headstone until after Easter 1952, not because of family disputes, as was conveniently suggested, but to coordinate with the delayed revelation of Mrs. Hartwell's true intentions. By the time the memorial was finally placed, sufficient time had passed for the deception to become undetectable through casual observation. Counselor Kemp shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the implications of what was being revealed. "Inspector, you're describing a conspiracy that involved multiple participants and extended over several years. What could possibly justify such elaborate deception?" The answer, Counselor, lies in the complicated relationship between Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell and Mr. Timothy Finch, a gentleman whom many of you will remember as a prominent figure in municipal affairs during the 1940s. Purbright's tone remained perfectly neutral, though his words carried the weight of documented betrayal. Mr. Finch and Mrs. Hartwell had maintained a romantic relationship during the early years of that decade, which he terminated quite abruptly when his political advisers convinced him that the association might damage his prospects for civic advancement. The silence that followed was filled with the small sounds of a community discovering that its most respectable citizens had occasionally possessed private lives considerably less admirable than their public reputations suggested. "Mrs. Hartwell," Purbright continued with the gentle philosophy that had sustained him through decades of investigating human nature in its more creative aspects, apparently considered this abandonment a profound betrayal of trust, one that justified extraordinary measures to ensure that Mr. Finch would never achieve the posthumous reconciliation he appeared to seek. Edwin Finch straightened slightly in his chair, as if preparing to accept responsibility for sins that were not entirely his own. "Inspector," he said quietly, "my father spent years visiting what he believed was Mrs. Hartwell's grave. He brought flowers, apparently seeking some form of absolution for his behavior. He never knew that his attempts at making amends were being frustrated by her careful planning." "Indeed, Mr. Finch, your father's regular visits to Section C were observed by several witnesses, though none understood the irony of his situation." Purbright's voice carried a note of sympathy for all parties involved in this elaborate, posthumous conflict. Mrs. Hartwell had achieved perfect justice, denying him the peace he sought, while ensuring he would never understand why his gestures of remorse provided no spiritual comfort. Mrs. Crispin finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "She deserved her privacy, Inspector. And he had forfeited any right to disturb it." The recent disturbance at the cemetery was explained with the same methodical precision that had characterized the original deception. Edwin Finch had discovered his father's letters among family papers, learned the truth about the relationship and its aftermath, and attempted to destroy evidence that might damage the family reputation posthumously. Mr. Finch's actions were motivated by filial loyalty rather than criminal intent, Purbright observed, with the understanding of someone who had spent his career distinguishing between malice and misguided devotion. His attempt to destroy the remaining correspondence was both unsuccessful and ultimately unnecessary. The truth he sought to conceal had been waiting 40 years for someone to ask the right questions in the right order. Canon Holden cleared his throat with clerical delicacy. "Inspector, if I may, what of forgiveness? What of the possibility that Mr. Finch's later remorse might have been genuine?" "An excellent question, Canon, and one that touches upon the fundamental tension between justice and mercy that has troubled theologians considerably more qualified than myself." Purbright smiled slightly, as if appreciating the complexity of moral questions that defied simple resolution. Mrs. Hartwell had clearly decided that some betrayals transcend the conventional possibilities of forgiveness. Her arrangements ensured that Mr. Finch would experience the consequences of his choices without the comfort of believing that time had healed the wounds he had inflicted. As the meeting prepared to conclude, Purbright reflected on the case's evolution from a simple administrative irregularity into a profound exploration of human nature in its most calculating and vulnerable aspects. The empty grave, ladies and gentlemen, was not an error or oversight, but the centerpiece of a carefully planned act of posthumous revenge. Mrs. Hartwell chose cremation to deny Mr. Finch any physical location where he could demonstrate his remorse or maintain any connection to her memory. Mrs. Bracknell consulted her agenda with the expression of someone who had learned that municipal problems generally required more complex solutions than initially appeared necessary. "What is to be done about the cemetery records, Inspector? And what of the financial irregularities?" "The cemetery records will be amended to reflect the true nature of Mrs. Hartwell's final arrangements. Memorial only, no interment. As for Mrs. Crispin's financial management of other estates, that is a separate matter that has been addressed through appropriate restitution." Purbright gathered his papers with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully transformed a collection of puzzling facts into a coherent narrative. Mrs. Hartwell's deception was elaborate, but it was conducted with the full knowledge and consent of all parties directly involved. No laws were broken, though several conventions were creatively interpreted. Edwin Finch stood slowly, as if the weight of family history had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "Inspector, I want to apologize for my interference with your investigation. My father's behavior was his responsibility, not mine, but I felt obligated to protect his memory." "Your loyalty is admirable, Mr. Finch, even when misguided," Purbright replied with the gentle courtesy that had served him well in countless encounters with citizens who had made unfortunate choices for admirable reasons. "Perhaps the best service you can provide to your father's memory is to allow the truth to stand without further concealment." As the committee members prepared to leave, Canon Holden paused beside Purbright's chair. "Inspector," he said quietly, "you have managed to reveal this community's secrets without requiring anyone to feel morally superior to anyone else. In my profession, that is considered something approaching a miracle." "It is merely patient arithmetic, Canon," Purbright replied with the philosophical satisfaction of someone who had spent his career proving that human nature, however complex, could be understood through careful observation and persistent inquiry. "Subtract heat, add light, divide blame until it dissolves into understanding." Sergeant Love, who had been documenting the proceedings with methodical precision, allowed himself a final question. "Do you think Mrs. Hartwell would be satisfied with how this has concluded, sir?" "I think," Purbright said, watching Mrs. Crispin speak quietly with Mr. Pegg about cemetery maintenance schedules, "that she would have appreciated the arithmetic. And she would have found considerable satisfaction in knowing that Mr. Finch spent years bringing flowers to an address that was never equipped to receive them." Outside, Flaxborough resumed its gentle afternoon routines, unaware that one of its longest-kept secrets had finally been revealed through the patient application of careful questions and systematic investigation. The empty grave had served its purpose magnificently, denying Timothy Finch the closure he had sought, while ensuring that his son would eventually confront the consequences of choices made decades before his birth. Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell had achieved something remarkable in death, a form of justice that transcended conventional legal remedies while demonstrating that ordinary people, given sufficient motivation and careful planning, could craft revenge more elegant and enduring than any court could impose. Her deception had been simultaneously cruel and admirable, calculated and compassionate, proving that human nature, in its most complex manifestations, often defied the simple moral categories that communities preferred to maintain. The case was closed, the truth revealed, and Inspector Purbright could return to his quiet paperwork with the satisfaction of someone who had once again proven that patience, observation, and the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions could illuminate even the most carefully guarded secrets that communities carried in their collective memory. The morning brought one of those settled clarities that made Flaxborough appear almost philosophical, as if the town had spent the night considering recent revelations and decided that truth, however long delayed, was preferable to the maintenance of elaborate fictions. The railway buffet was first to resume normal conditions, though there was a distinct reduction in theories involving foreign agents and an equivalent rise in sentiments prefaced by poor woman. Mrs. Alty, at the haberdashery, allowed that privacy was a tender thing, like lawn in a drought, while Mrs. Pegg replied that privacy, like lawn, did best when nobody trod on it. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station to find Sergeant Love already installed with tea, in the sort of satisfied expression that suggested someone who had spent the evening organizing facts into their proper relationships. The stolen garden gnomes, which had patiently awaited resolution, had been discovered arranged by height beside an allotment shed, the work of a meditative art student who described his project as curating a tableau. Love had secured their return after obtaining a promise that future curating would be conducted in situ, writing his report with barely concealed relief at having rescued an entire peasantry from avant-garde captivity. Mrs. Amelia Crispin had reopened her tea shop with the quiet dignity of someone whose reputation had survived official scrutiny. The morning customers returned with the loyalty that characterized those who understood that human nature occasionally required accommodation beyond the strict boundaries of conventional behavior. Her financial irregularities had been addressed through discreet restitution, and her role in Mrs. Hartwell's elaborate deception was now regarded as evidence of devoted friendship rather than criminal conspiracy. Good sponge, as several patrons observed, was an absolution of a sort. She asked me to scatter them, Mrs. Crispin had mentioned to Inspector Purbright during his afternoon tea, speaking with the tone of someone who had reached the end of her preparedness. Her ashes. Not at the cemetery. In her garden, under the quince. She thought it better to be among something that would be tended without sentiment. A reasonable horticultural theology, Purbright had replied. A quince is faithful and keeps its secrets, like some people we could name. Edwin Finch had resumed his bicycle maintenance with the focused attention of someone who had discovered that mechanical problems were generally more manageable than psychological legacies inherited from previous generations. He had made a quiet trip to Section C, walking the final yards to Mrs. Hartwell's memorial, then returned by the longer path. Mr. Pegg, pruning a yew with unsentimental tenderness, had watched him go and thought not unkindly that some grief required exercise. Finch's shop had experienced a modest increase in business from customers who appreciated the romantic complexity of his family history, though he handled such attention with the same methodical precision he applied to brake adjustments. The cemetery had returned to its customary tranquility. Pegg had replaced Mrs. Hartwell's headstone with careful attention, though the inscription now included a discreet notation, "Memorial only. No interment." The Ellison yard had produced, 3 weeks later, a small amendment to the stone, an incised symbol of a branch in bloom at the lower right. No, one could say precisely why it changed the memorial's expression from stoical to content, but it did. Mrs. Bracknell had convened the cemetery committee with the determination of someone who believed that municipal problems, once resolved, should remain resolved. The official records were amended with appropriate discretion, and new guidelines were issued for bereavement liaison, a phrase that made Canon Halden wince slightly. His Sunday sermon had spoken gently about the arithmetic of blame and the grace of restraint, concluding that Mrs. Hartwell's arrangements demonstrated both the power of carefully planned revenge and the ultimate complexity of human justice. Those who attended found it a comfort. Dr. Carfax, vindicated in his original diagnosis and observations about Mrs. Hartwell's private nature, had resumed his garden maintenance with professional satisfaction. He had sent a basket of quinces to the tea shop, a gesture that was noted and appreciated without requiring explanation. The town's collective response had been characterized by the sort of philosophical acceptance that suggested a community comfortable with the knowledge that its most respectable citizens occasionally possessed private lives considerably more interesting than their public reputations indicated. Timothy Finch's political career was remembered with understanding. municipal advancement sometimes required personal sacrifices that were both comprehensible and regrettable. Mrs. Hartwell's elaborate revenge was discussed with the admiration generally reserved for complex planning that achieved its intended results without unnecessary collateral damage. Mr. Merriman had supervised the insertion of corrections in the cemetery register, producing clerkly script that conveyed not only accuracy, but an air of having always been true. He then wrote a memorandum containing the words "matter resolved" and "amendments complete," which had a soporific effect upon municipal anxieties. As evening approached, Inspector Purbright found himself reflecting on the investigation's broader implications. The case had demonstrated that ordinary people could maintain extraordinary secrets when they believed those secrets served legitimate purposes. Mrs. Hartwell had achieved something remarkable in death, a form of justice that transcended conventional legal remedies while proving that careful planning, devoted friendship, and the willingness to challenge expectations could produce results more elegant and enduring than any court could impose. "An interesting conclusion to our investigation, Sergeant," he observed, as Love prepared to leave for the day. "Mrs. Hartwell crafted a deception that served justice while protecting privacy, denied closure while maintaining dignity, and achieved revenge without descending to cruelty." "Indeed, sir. She understood that control, when exercised with sufficient foresight, can be a remarkably potent instrument." Love gathered his papers with satisfaction. The empty grave served its purpose magnificently. "Quite so, Sergeant. And now it can rest, or rather, continue not resting, with appropriate dignity." Purbright turned down his desk lamp with the philosophical contentment of someone who had spent his career proving that human nature, however complex, could be understood through patience and persistent inquiry. Outside, Flaxborough settled into its evening routines with the comfortable rhythm that characterized a community that had successfully integrated new knowledge without requiring dramatic changes in daily behavior. In Section C of the municipal cemetery, Mrs. Hartwell's memorial maintained its patient vigil over earth that had never known her physical presence but had successfully preserved her psychological legacy for nearly 40 years. The case had concluded with a sort of resolution that left all parties feeling that truth had been served without requiring anyone to feel morally superior to anyone else. Mrs. Hartwell had achieved her revenge, Mrs. Crispin had demonstrated devoted friendship, and Edwin Finch had learned that family legacies sometimes required acceptance rather than concealment. Inspector Purbright gathered his papers and prepared to return to the quiet paperwork that characterized most police work in a community where dramatic crimes were less common than the small human complications that arose when ordinary people attempted to manage extraordinary circumstances. The empty grave had revealed its secrets, the truth had been acknowledged, and Flaxborough could return to its gentle routines with the satisfaction of a community that had successfully navigated another encounter with the creative complexity of human nature. Tomorrow there would be something new, a complaint about a dog that barked in Latin, perhaps, or a query about whether jam could be considered a controlled substance. But tonight, in the tidy drawer marked "closed," a woman who preferred exactness to sentiment was represented by a stone that told the truth at last. It was a good compromise, as such things go. The end.